My name is Cassandra Blake. 3 years ago, my entire family threw me out of the house over an inheritance lawsuit I never even filed. They called me a traitor, a greedy child, the final shame they had to cut loose. But last night, I received an anonymous email. Check the wall behind the third picture frame. And what I found was a safe. Have you ever had your own family create a story just to bury something they didn't want anyone to find? I never imagined a single piece of paper could unravel everything I believed to be true. If you've stayed with me this far, leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe. Because what I'm about to share might just change the way you see your own family. And it all started with a photograph my family had hidden for 19 years. I stood for a long time in front of the wall in my mother's room, where the third frame hung slightly askew compared to the others. It was an old portrait, my mom standing next to a strange man. His eyes stared coldly into the camera. Nothing about him said family. That photo had never once hung in our house during all the years I grew up, and now, somehow, it was the key to something my gut told me was deeply important. I took the frame down. Behind the plaster, there was a narrow wooden gap. When I tapped it with a hammer, it echoed, hollow, like a wall keeping secrets. I gently pried at the edges, and after a few sharp breaths, I uncovered a small wooden door, locked with a combination dial. Not a modern lock, but the kind of rotary dial safes used in banks during the 70s. One number came to mind. Mom's birthday, 0419. Then came my sister's birthday, the sister my family always insisted I had imagined. 1226. The name Savannah had never been spoken aloud, but she lived in my memory like a shadow I could never shake. As a kid, I used to draw the two of us playing in the backyard. Mom tore up the drawings and said I was delusional. Doctors called it post-traumatic dissociation after a car accident. But I never believed them. I never forgot her. I spun the dial to Savannah's birthday. A dry click sounded, and the door creaked open. Inside was a heavy metal safe. No bank statements, no jewelry, just a small wooden box, a brown leather journal, and a stack of loose photographs tied with a fabric ribbon. I reached for the top sheet, and the first thing I saw was a birth certificate. But it wasn't mine. Name, Savannah C. Blake. Date of birth, December 26, 1989. Parents, Clara Blake, Thomas Blake. Address, 17 Wilmington Road, Philadelphia. I stared at the paper like it might burst into flames in my hand. They told me my sister never existed. That the car accident when I was 7 was something I invented in grief. But why was I holding her birth certificate? I opened the leather journal. The first pages were my mother's handwriting, sharp, short sentences with exclamation points, like planning notes. But the pages after that were written in a different hand. Softer, thinner strokes. Some lines even shook, like from a trembling grip. I recognized the script. It was my grandmother's, the woman I had once been so close to, who passed when I was just 11. Savannah is still alive. But Clara has made her decision. I do not agree. I stayed silent not out of fear, but because Cassandra was too young. I read that line over and over, like a broken spell that still carried power. Savannah is still alive. Each word sliced through everything I thought I knew. That I was an only child, that my memories were fiction, that my mind was broken. I turned to the photos. One showed 2 little girls on a lawn, one tying a ribbon into the other's hair. I recognized the fox print blue dress. I wore that when I was 6. So who was the other girl? Darker hair, bigger eyes, a crooked smile. My sister. Another photo showed 2 girls reading on a red carpet, the same carpet we had in our old reading room before it was replaced with hardwood when I was 8. I remembered it clearly because I had scratched that floor after falling once. I knelt down and checked the spot. The mark was still there. And in the photo, the red carpet was intact. Everything matched. Every lie began to crumble. I closed the safe, hugged the evidence to my chest, and walked out of that room without locking the door again. A chill ran down my spine, but something warm lit up in my chest, confirmation. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't alone, and I no longer lived in someone else's version of my past. That night, I opened my laptop and searched for Savannah C. Blake in Vermont, a state tied to suspicious quarterly money transfers from my family's account. I found a financial record under Inchecks as C. Blake, listed as a resident of a psychiatric facility called Northfield Haven, in the hills of Burlington. I dialed the center, posing as someone trying to schedule a tour for a relative. My voice shook as I gripped the edge of the desk. The receptionist asked, "Which patient?" I hesitated, then answered, "C. Blake." She paused, then replied, "Patient SCB is under special guardianship." We only allow access to immediate family or authorized legal representatives. I hung up, my heart pounded. Her name was still in their system. No deceased. No closed file. Savannah C. Blake was alive. I sat frozen, staring at the dimmed screen. My sister hadn't vanished. She had been hidden. And I was going to bring her back. It took me nearly 2 hours to plan my trip to Vermont. I booked a bus, reserved a room, prepped documents. I told no one. No texts, no calls. I even deleted the itinerary from my phone, keeping only a paper copy in case someone tracked my steps. I chose the overnight bus leaving Philadelphia at 5 a.m., arriving in Burlington in the late afternoon. My backpack carried a few outfits, my notebook, Savannah's birth certificate, and the photos I couldn't bring myself to look at again. On the bus, I couldn't sleep. The trees and houses slid past the window like memories unraveling. Wood cabins, old oak trees, slanted sunlight across asphalt. But inside me, a river ran backward, toward childhood, toward dreams I'd been forced to forget. I reached Northfield Haven around 4:30. The sky was gray, the air cold enough to sting my wrists, a reminder this was no ordinary visit. The facility sat on a hill, sloped roof, stone walls, regal yet secretive. I entered the reception hall, where the scent of antiseptic drifted beneath warm pine. A woman in her 50s, with dragonfly glasses and a gray cardigan, looked up as I approached. "May I help you?" I took a deep breath. "I'm here to see a relative. Her name is Savannah Blake. I believe she's staying here." She typed quickly, her eyes on the screen. "Savannah C. Blake. She's currently an inpatient. But you'll need proof of kinship or legal authorization." I handed over a copy of the birth certificate. She studied it for a long moment, then nodded. "Please have a seat. I'll notify the head nurse." I sat in a brown cushioned chair by the window, fingers laced together. Each minute dragged like iron. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. Then a calm female voice behind me. "Are you Cassandra?" I turned around. A woman in a sea blue nurse uniform stood there, slender but strong. She led me down a long, curving hallway, the dim yellow light casting shadows on the cold stone walls. We stopped in front of room 207. The door was slightly ajar. I stepped inside. The room was small, simple. A bed by the window, a low bookshelf, a cushioned chair, and an old writing desk. She was sitting there, back turned to me. Her hair, long and streaked with gray and brown, was loosely tied with a fabric ribbon. That hair, that posture, my heart clenched. "Savannah?" I called, my voice catching. She turned around. Her eyes met mine like a cold gust of wind, fragile, but enough to make me tremble. "Is that Cassie?" I nodded. She stood slowly, stepping toward me, her small hands trembling as they reached to touch my cheek. "They told me I imagined you, that you weren't real." I don't know when I embraced her. But suddenly, we were holding each other, standing in that worn-out room like two puzzle pieces forced apart, now returned to their rightful place. How long have you been here?" I asked, voice shaking. "Since I was 15. Mom said I was sick, that I needed treatment, but I didn't understand, Cassie. I just opposed them changing Grandpa's will. I just asked too many questions. Then one day, they brought me here." Her story unraveled like tangled thread. She'd been sent here on what was supposed to be a wellness retreat and never returned. Every year, a stranger would come to sign papers and pay the bills. Every quarter, a wire transfer arrived at the facility, no sender listed. "Do you have anyone you've kept in touch with? Friends? Anyone besides me?" "No one. Sometimes I wrote letters to Grandpa. But no one ever replied." I took her hand. It was ice cold. "I'm getting you out of here. I have proof. The birth certificate, the photos, Grandma's notebook, everything. We don't have to stay silent anymore." She shook her head, eyes red and glassy. "They won't let this go, Cassie. Mom gave up everything to protect that inheritance. She'll stop at nothing. But you survived. That alone proves they were wrong." I left her my number and promised I'd return with a lawyer and the proper documents to get her released. Before leaving, I turned to look at her one more time, in the fading evening light through the window. That face was no longer a haunted memory from my childhood. It was my sister. My real sister. Back in the lobby, I called Miranda. "I need you to verify any bank accounts under the name Savannah C. Blake, even shell accounts or proxies." "Cassie," she said, her voice softening, "this is bigger than I thought. A Vermont account was recently used to send funds to an organization called the Silverpine Foundation. It's supposedly a nonprofit founded by your mother, and Savannah is the named beneficiary. I froze. I never imagined a single birth certificate could dismantle an entire empire. If you don't believe it, share this video so others will know too. Send me everything you can on that foundation. I want to know who signed off on those transfers. I looked down at my hands. My eyes stung, not from anger, but because now I knew my sister's disappearance wasn't an accident, it was strategy. And I would uncover every layer they built, every thread they stitched across her mouth for 2 decades. This search wasn't over. It had only just begun. I left Vermont the next morning. That night at the motel, I couldn't sleep. I lay stiff on the hard mattress, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with 100 unanswered questions. What had they done to my sister for the past 20 years? Why a psychiatric facility? And what was the Silverpine Foundation, really? Why was Savannah listed as its beneficiary? I returned to Philadelphia with a deep sense of dislocation. Everything in my old apartment looked different. The light through the curtains, the little dining table I'd bought on clearance from South Street. It no longer felt like home. Just an empty shell echoing a silence deeper than any room. As soon as I arrived, I called Miranda. She was usually calm, but this time her voice held hesitation. I double-checked everything, Cassie. The Silverpine Foundation was established by your mother in 2003, just a few months after your sister disappeared. Each quarter, the foundation receives funds from a network of sources, mainly from the family company and some anonymous investment funds. And the listed beneficiary is Savannah.
Yes?
But on paper, Savannah is marked as a patient under full cognitive disability. Her legal guardian is Clara Blake, your mother. I sank into my chair, like someone had pushed me off a ledge I didn't even realize I was on. It was all part of a plan. Remove my sister from society, keep her confined under the guise of protection, then use her name to launder funds from the family's estate. Every wire transfer was technically legal, because there was a beneficiary. I asked, is there a way to find out who signed the transfer authorizations? Miranda replied quickly, yes. Since she's under guardianship, every signature belongs to your mother. But I found something else, something disturbing. What is it? About 4 months ago, a large transfer, nearly $300,000, was wired from the Silverpine Foundation to an overseas account. That account is registered under Logan Blake. I went silent. Logan is my cousin, Uncle Paul's son. In our family, Logan was the golden boy, smart, well-spoken, working at an investment firm in Manhattan. I never thought he was involved, but now? I wasn't sure I trusted anyone. Can you send me a copy of that transaction? I've already placed it in your secure inbox. Be careful with it. Cassie, this level of financial abuse could lead to criminal charges. I know, and I'm not letting it slide. I hung up, then sat still for a moment before getting up to retrieve the flash drive from my bedroom safe. The one where I kept all the documents. The photos. The birth certificate scans. Grandma's journal. The transfer records. Each piece, on its own, might seem small. But together, they formed a clear picture. They didn't just erase Savannah, they used her. For 20 years, she was their financial shield. I knew I needed more proof. And I knew exactly where to find it. My father's office, Thomas Blake's, was on the 3rd floor of the old house in Rittenhouse. It was his private workspace, a place I was never allowed to enter as a child. Even after Mom transferred most of the business to Logan, Dad held onto that room as if it were his personal fortress. That night, I went to the old house. I still had my key from when I moved out. The house was completely dark, as if everything inside it was either asleep or dead. I moved quietly down the hallway, up the creaky wooden staircase, recognizing the familiar groan of each step. Dad's office door was still locked, as always. But the lock was old. And a few minutes of patience, I managed to open it. The room was cold and smelled of damp wood. The walls were covered in investment maps, red stamped documents, and photos of real estate projects. I wasn't interested in any of that. I went straight to the large wooden cabinet in the corner, where my father used to stash his most important papers. Opening the second drawer from the bottom, I found a thick, sealed envelope. Handwritten on it. Trust assets, SCBO do not open without consent. I tore it open. Inside was a detailed inventory of assets under the name Savannah C. Blake, including 3 plots of land in Vermont, a lakeside property, and shares in the investment firm Logan managed. All of it had been legalized through indirect authorization by her legal guardian, my mother. And every document was signed by my mother, while my sister was declared legally incapacitated. I stepped back, heart pounding. I pulled out my phone and took photos of every page, every signature. Then I opened my notebook and wrote down the date, time, and exact location I had found the documents. Every detail had to be logged, because I knew this would be the key evidence. As I was about to leave, my eyes fell on an old photo sitting on the bookshelf. It was a family portrait from when I was 10, me, Mom, Dad, and Savannah. That same brown hair, that same red dress I remembered. The photo had once been cut in half. Now, it was whole again. I picked it up, my hands trembling. They hadn't erased her from memory. They just buried her any way they could. I walked out of the room, quietly closing the door behind me. In the hallway, a cold draft blew through the window pane. Maybe it was just a breeze, but it felt like something, or someone, maybe even the house itself, was whispering to me. It's time to bring it all into the light. I returned to my apartment feeling something unfamiliar, not anger, not relief. It was like carrying something too heavy to name, but too real to deny. What I found in my father's office felt like slicing into the core of a memory they had spent years trying to erase. And the scariest part wasn't the truth itself, it was how masterfully they made it look like it had never existed. The next morning, I sent all the photos, documents, and notes to Miranda. She scheduled to meet me that afternoon at a small cafe on 22nd Street, the kind of place we used to meet when we needed privacy. Miranda arrived on time, carrying a thick folder and a look that was both cautious and resolute. She set down her espresso and slid the folder across the table to me. This is everything I pulled from the state's notarization and financial record system. The assets listed under Savannah's name have an estimated market value of about $4.3 million, not counting the equity in Logan's company. I opened the folder. The documents were organized chronologically. First, the original will from my grandfather, naming Savannah as the primary heir to the Charleston property and the Vermont land portfolio. Then came the later amendments, bearing Mom's signature and Savannah's absent consent. The court will ask why she didn't sign, Miranda said, eyes fixed on the page. But since your sister was labeled legally incapacitated, the law allows your mother to sign on her behalf. The issue is, she was never formally evaluated by an independent organization, I finished the sentence. And my mother didn't have the authority to declare that on her own. Miranda nodded. I also found records from Northfield Haven. There's no formal psychiatric assessment in her file. Just a note from an internist, one where near sufficient to legally determine incapacity. I clenched my fists, my nails pressed into my palms, just to remind myself I was fully awake. Are you ready to take this to court? Miranda asked, her voice softer now, but clearer than ever. I nodded. No hesitation. Not just for Savannah. For everyone who's ever been locked behind a family door no one believed was real. She smiled. Not the kind of smile that meant joy, but the kind that said, I've waited too long for this moment. Then let's begin. That night, I went home and reopened a special email inbox I had set up for emergencies. Inside were dozens of unsent drafts, letters to my mother, to my father, to Savannah, even letters I'd written to myself on sleepless nights. I opened one of the old drafts. The first line read, if one day you uncover the truth, remember, you're not crazy. You're just the only one willing to open your eyes. I didn't feel alone anymore, and I knew it was time for others to see what I had seen. I opened my laptop and created a folder titled Whistle Record, like the whistle I used to think I heard in dreams, but now knew was the sound of truth begging to be heard. I made a visual summary, a timeline of Savannah's disappearance, the properties transferred, the money that flowed from Silverpine to Logan, and all the supporting documents. Everything attached with photos, clearly labeled dates and proof. I knew a lawyer wasn't enough. I needed the public. I needed people to know, so that when I stepped into court, it wouldn't just be my story anymore. If you've ever heard a story that felt off, but no one believed you, share this video. It might be the confirmation someone desperately needs to hear. I logged into my old Twitter account. It had been dormant since college. My profile picture was still a shot of wild daisies I took in Vermont. I posted a simple tweet. Have you ever been forced to believe the person you loved never existed? I just found my sister, after 20 years locked away in a facility our mother signed her into. Attached was a photo, Savannah's birth certificate, a picture of the two of us, and the visual timeline summary. I hit post. Then I sat quietly, not waiting for anything specific, but knowing I'd just crossed a line no one could push me back from. Just over an hour later, that once-forgotten Twitter account lit up. Messages began pouring in, from strangers, from reporters, from names I didn't recognize but who clearly knew my family. A woman named Elise wrote, "I used to be a nurse at Northfield. I remember Savannah. I always felt something was off." Another message, "I was her classmate in middle school. Everyone thought she was dead." I read each line in silence, overwhelmed by a strange feeling. It wasn't victory. It was validation, that my voice was finally being heard. That evening, while I was sorting documents to submit to my lawyer, the doorbell rang. I stood up, walking slowly toward the door, still clutching the paperwork I hadn't yet set down. On the security screen was a familiar face, thinner now, eyes swollen and red. It was my mother. I opened the door. The night breeze from the hallway swept in, carrying a scent I couldn't tell was her perfume or just a trace of the past refusing to close. "I want to talk, Cassie," she said, her voice low and raspy like she'd been crying. I stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. She walked in slowly, no longer carrying that confident or commanding presence I once remembered. She sat down on the sofa, her hands resting gently on her lap, not looking directly at me. I didn't ask anything. I just waited. After a while, she spoke. "I don't know what you already know, but I wanted to talk before you take this too far." I sat across from her, still holding the file. I placed it on the table, in full view. "I think too far happened 20 years ago, when you signed Savannah into a care facility and never went back." Mom looked at me, for the first time in years, without denial, without anger, without dodging, just silence. "I didn't have a choice back then," she said softly, like she was telling herself a story she was no longer sure she believed. "Savannah found out that your grandfather left her something in his will. She started asking questions. She got rebellious. She called a lawyer. I was scared it would all fall apart." I looked straight into her eyes. "So you chose to imprison her, to lock away her entire life?" "I didn't call it imprisonment," she said with a sad smile. "I called it preserving the peace of a family falling apart." I wanted to scream, but I was too tired for anger. I just whispered, "You called it preserving peace. I call it destroying a human being." She lowered her head. Her hands trembled. "Cassie, if I told you I regret it, would you believe me?" I didn't answer right away. She reached for a tissue from the table, wiped her face. "I hoped you'd never find out, that you'd live peacefully, forget the past. But I know. You're more like your grandmother than I ever realized. Once you see a crack, you won't stop until you reach the foundation." I leaned back, still watching her every move. "I'm not doing this out of revenge. You know that, don't you? Then why? Because if I don't, then all those years Savannah spent in the dark will mean nothing. I can't let that happen. I can't let everyone keep pretending she never existed." Mom nodded slowly. Her eyes were red and watery. "I hid all her photos in a drawer, erased her name from the family tree. But I never forgot. Every night, I dream of her standing on the porch, soaked in rain, calling for me to open the door. But you didn't open it." I said it softly, like breath. But each word landed like stone. My mother pulled an envelope from her purse. She placed it on the table without a word. I didn't rush to open it. "What is it?" "An original document I never filed. A final piece of your grandfather's will. It grants full ownership of the Vermont land to Savannah, and another portion to you." I looked at the envelope as if it were glowing. Not because of its value, but because it was one last shard of truth. Something I never thought she'd hand over. "You don't need to forgive me," she said, her voice cracking. "I just hope that maybe, somehow, not all your memories of me will be made of anger." I didn't answer. I didn't reject her either. I just watched her stand up and walk to the door. "I won't stop you. Do what you believe is right. But please, don't let everything this family once had end in headlines and court transcripts." I stood still. I didn't promise. I didn't deny. As she stepped outside, I realized I had just witnessed something I hadn't seen in all of my 34 years. My mother knew she had lost. And for the first time, she didn't try to win. The first court hearing was scheduled for Monday, exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, at the Philadelphia Civil Courthouse, Courtroom 3. I remembered the exact moment I received the formal notice from Miranda, the date, the presiding judge, and a checklist of documents to prepare. Everything felt like a symphony waiting to be played, just waiting for the right cue. That morning, it was drizzling. The rain misted gently across the stone-paved sidewalk outside the courthouse gates. I arrived early, entered through the side door designated for plaintiffs, my long coat hugging a body that trembled, not from cold, but from anticipation. I had never stood in court before, but today, I wasn't just standing for myself. Miranda was already inside with her assistant. They brought 2 large file bags, a laptop preloaded with our slideshow presentation, and printed copies of every document I had given them. Savannah's birth certificate, the original will from our grandfather, transcripts of recorded statements, and the financial transactions bearing my mother's signature. "You holding up?" Miranda asked gently as we stood in the hallway. I nodded, eyes fixed on the heavy wooden door. "Just tell your truth. What you lived through. You don't have to prove you're right. You just have to remind them. Savannah was real." The door opened. The clerk called the case. We stepped into the courtroom. Across from us, my mother sat beside her attorney, a man in his 50s, salt and pepper hair, dark suit, a gleaming metal watch. She didn't look at me. Her gaze stayed fixed on the tabletop. And Logan, my cousin, sat to her left, arms crossed, lips pressed tight like he was swallowing his fury. The room was so quiet, I could hear the judge's pen tapping steadily against her desk. She was a black woman, likely in her late 50s, wearing thin-rimmed glasses, her gaze stern but not cold. Her eyes scanned the room before she began. "The civil case between Ms. Cassandra Blake and Ms. Clara Blake, along with other relevant parties, is now officially open. Purpose: to petition for a review of the legal guardianship of Ms. Savannah Blake, and to verify the legality of all asset transfers and related ownership rights." I was called as the first witness. I walked slowly, lightly gripping the hem of my dress for balance. I took a seat and looked directly at the judge. And then I spoke. I told them about the years when no one uttered my sister's name. About the photographs that were taken down without explanation. The shock of finding her birth certificate. The trip to Vermont. Room 207. Her voice, soft as wind, calling my name like someone waking from a long sleep. I told them about my grandmother's notebook. About the bank account in Savannah's name but controlled by someone else. About the recordings, the photographs, the forged transfer documents. Every detail, I shared them clearly, without hesitation. My mother still wouldn't look up. After Miranda finished presenting our evidence, it was my mother's lawyer's turn to respond. He stood, his voice layered with concern. "Your Honor, my client, Miss Clara Blake, does not deny that her daughter, Savannah, is currently under specialized care. But this was solely due to her mental health, which was documented years ago. The asset transfers were legal, conducted under the guardianship Ms. Blake rightfully held, in accordance with applicable regulations." "What doctor produced the original mental competency evaluation?" the judge asked. The attorney hesitated for a beat. "We currently do not have the original documents in our possession." The judge frowned. "So there are no independent diagnoses, no medical reports from a neutral healthcare facility for the past 20 years. Silence from the lawyer. I could feel my breathing begin to steady. "Your Honor," Miranda rose, "we've also submitted a statement from Savannah Blake's former attending physician at Northfield, confirming that she was never formally evaluated for competency." The judge sat up straighter, flipping a page in her folder. "And this recording," she said, pressing play on a small device, "documents Miss Clara Blake's own words. She only objected to the changes in her grandfather's will. She started asking questions. She called a lawyer. I was scared." My mother's voice echoed through the courtroom, sending a chill through the air. I saw Logan lean slightly forward. His forehead was damp with sweat. The judge turned to me. "Ms. Blake, if what you've shared is true, and the evidence seems to strongly support it, then this is not just a case of wrongful guardianship. It points to the concealment of a family member, abuse of assets, and potentially long-term civil fraud." I said nothing, just nodded. The judge made a few notes, then looked over to the opposing counsel. "This hearing is now in recess. Within 7 days, the defense must submit all medical records, financial documents, and paperwork proving lawful guardianship. Failure to do so will result in immediate suspension of the current guardianship and full referral to the district attorney's office for further investigation." She struck the gavel. Court adjourned. I stood up. Miranda looked at me. She didn't say a word, but in her eyes was something I hadn't seen during all these months: belief. Not just in the system, but in the power of a buried story to be reclaimed, through the voice of someone who lived it. I returned home late that evening, as the last silver threads of daylight slipped past the edge of the city. My apartment was as quiet as always, but this time, that silence wasn't a wall I had to push through. It felt like a pause, like the stillness after a piece of music ends on a low note. I brewed a pot of chamomile tea, sat at my desk, and reopened my laptop. Messages were still pouring in from the article I had posted the day before. A young woman from Indiana sent a photo of her mother's journal, a woman who had once lived at Northfield, documenting multiple names similar to Savannah's. A man from Maine shared that his grandmother had been my grandfather's private librarian and was suddenly forced into early retirement after seeing something she shouldn't have during an inheritance meeting. I read every message, every thank you note, every question, and I realized this was no longer just my story or Savannah's. It belonged to dozens of people who'd been erased from family photos, made to believe their memories were wrong, that their instincts were just overreaction. The next morning, I woke early and went for a run along the riverside path, just like I always did. But this time, every step felt lighter in a new way. Miranda called while I was tying my shoelace beneath an old oak tree. The court has officially suspended your mother's guardianship, and we've filed the petition to restore Savannah's legal status, with you as her temporary guardian. I stood up, a cool breeze drifting across my collar. Thank you, Miranda. But I think the next step shouldn't just be legal. What do you mean? I want to do something. Not just for Savannah, but for people like her. That night, I began planning a new organization. It wasn't flashy. No big logos, no elaborate headquarters. I borrowed a small wooden house on the outskirts of Charleston, the lakeside cabin where my grandfather used to take Savannah and me fishing one summer. The house was still there, old wooden floors, faded gray shingles, stained glass windows dim with age. I cleaned it out over 3 days, bought chairs, rolled out rugs, hung the lavender flower painting I found in storage. I named the place the Room with a Light, not because it was brighter than anywhere else, but because I wanted everyone who walked in to know, here you are not invisible. On opening day, there was no red ribbon, just a pot of warm soup, a few loaves of toasted bread, and 10 wooden chairs around a long table. The first to arrive was a girl named Janelle, labeled unstable by her brother after she refused to co-sign a family loan. The second was an elderly woman with silver hair who had lived in a nursing home for 12 years due to depression, a diagnosis no one ever asked her about. I didn't ask too many questions. I just offered them a cup of tea, a blank notebook, and said, if you want to write, you can write. If not, just being here is enough. Savannah arrived in the late afternoon. She wore an old sweater, her hair loosely tied at the nape of her neck, and in her hands was a small flower pot, purple gerbera daisies, the kind she used to love as a child. The moment I saw her step inside, I knew this place was real, not because of licenses or regulations, but because the one who had been left behind finally had a place to return to. That evening, after everyone had left, she and I sat together at the wooden table. I poured tea, and she pulled out a small notebook, wrote a few lines, then placed it gently on the table. I opened it and read. You pulled me out of the dark. Now I just hope I can help someone else find their way back. I reached for her hand. Said nothing. There was no need to. If you're still here, comment truth matters so I'll know you believe truth still holds value, even when it comes late. Outside, the night wind blew gently. The warm yellow light cast shadows on the old wall, like a quiet reminder. There was once a room that had been locked. But now, it was open, and light doesn't need permission to exist. A few weeks after the Room with a Light opened, it slowly became something strange and beautiful, both still and full of quiet movement. Not noisy, not the kind of movement cities make, but the kind that happens deep inside people. Women stepped into that room with cautious posture, guarded eyes, and stories that began with the same hesitant phrase. I don't know where to begin. Savannah became a part of that space so naturally. No one asked who she was. No one demanded she explain the 20 years of silence. She sat behind the tea counter, boiled water, packed cookies, quietly jotted down the names of those who needed a place to sleep that night. I'd often see her standing by the large window overlooking the lake, still holding a dish towel, her gaze soft as the dusk settled in violet tones. Some days, she didn't speak much, just wrote in her notebook. Some days, she laughed. Lightly, like early spring wind. And when I heard her laugh for the first time during a chilly afternoon, I knew. My sister had come back. I spent only half the week at the law office. The rest of my time was at the Room, helping Savannah organize small circle sessions, where people were invited to speak just one thing they had once been forbidden to say. One sentence. One emotion. One memory. Then, one day, Misha showed up. Mishka is my cousin. the youngest daughter of Uncle Paul, my father's brother. We had been close as children, until I turned 15, when whispers began swirling around me, whispers that I had mental issues. Misha stopped hanging out with me after that. She grew silent, quietly retreating from phone calls, family gatherings, and eventually disappeared from my life like a vanishing dream. That day, she walked into the room while I was slicing fruit for afternoon tea. Sunlight spilled across the shoulders of her coat, and I had to squint to recognize her. "Cassie?" I stood upright, wiping my hands on a cloth. "Hi, Misha." She looked around, uncertain. Then her eyes settled on Savannah, who was folding linens. "That's really her, isn't it?" I nodded. Misha walked toward the table slowly. She didn't speak until she reached us. "Do you remember me?" she asked softly. Savannah looked up. Her eyes lingered on Misha's face for a long moment, then she smiled. "You were the one who hid candy in your boots, weren't you?" Misha burst into tears. The three of us sat together that evening. The room was quiet, save for the wind brushing against the windows and the gentle flicker of candlelight. Misha told us she had always suspected, but never had the courage to question the grown-ups. That she had heard her mother mention Savannah once but was quickly silenced by her father. That after reading the article I'd posted, she hadn't been able to sleep for nights. "I'm sorry I believed everything they told me. I'm sorry I stayed quiet. I'm sorry I let you disappear from every picture in my memory." Savannah said nothing. She simply placed her hand over Misha's, softly. "You didn't erase me, Misha. They did. You were just a child." The three of us sat in silence for a long while. Then Misha spoke again. "I want to help. Even if it's just behind the scenes. I can do bookkeeping, clean up, anything." I smiled, because I knew, slowly, those who had once stood on the outside were finding their way back in. Not to rewrite the past, but to take responsibility for it. In the months that followed, the room with a light grew in ways no one had planned for. No campaigns, no loud announcements. Just whispered stories. Handwritten notes left at bookstores, laundromats, and churches. If you've ever felt like the extra piece in your own family, come by the house by the lake. One day, I found an unnamed journal on the welcome table. Inside was a single sentence. For the first time in 17 years, I told my story without shame. I closed the journal gently and placed it in the drawer. I began writing quarterly reports for the center. Not just for lawyers or auditors, but for myself, to remember that this work was real. I recorded the number of visitors, overnight stays, meals served, and the unnamed feedback. Each time I completed a report, I lit a candle beside a small photo frame near the door. An old picture of Savannah and me in Grandpa's backyard, two little girls blowing soap bubbles, eyes lifted toward the sky. If you know someone who's ever been erased from their own family, share this video with them. Maybe it's the first time they'll feel seen. One night, as I was locking the windows before bed, Savannah called me over. She handed me a small notebook with a soft blue cover, still fragrant with fresh paper. "Keep this," she said. "I call it the scene book. Every time someone walks in and shares their story, write it down. No names needed. Just remember that they were seen." I held the notebook to my chest, speechless. Because I knew every word written would be a testimony for the souls once locked in silence, and now they had a voice. That night, after Savannah and Misha had gone to bed, I stayed in the little kitchen by myself. On the table lay a pale cream envelope, no name, no stamp, only a shaky handwritten line. "For the keeper of the light." I opened it. Inside was a notarized copy, a certificate of ownership for the plot of land by the lake in Vermont that once belonged to my grandfather, along with another document. The official registration for the room with a light foundation, signed and sealed 3 days earlier by the state government. I stared at the rounded signature at the bottom of the page. It was my mother's. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't angry. I just felt a quiet stillness settle in me, deeper than usual. As if, in the end, she had chosen silence as a way to mend a part of the past, by leaving behind the one right thing she had left to give. I tucked the papers into the folder, stood up, and stepped out onto the back porch. The air wasn't too cold. The breeze carried the scent of damp grass and rotting wood. The lake in the distance lay still, like a mirror that no longer needed checking. The old wooden house had changed. No fresh paint, no flashy upgrades. But every nail in the roof, every brick along the path, every glass set on the wooden shelf, each one bore the mark of rebirth. Not rebirth from ruins, but from silence. Savannah was the first to call this place home. And that alone was enough to make me believe I had chosen the right path. The days that followed passed slowly. No big events. No courtroom dramas or tense meetings. Just ordinary days. People arriving and staying, stories unfolding with the gentle knock at the door each morning. I began to write more. Not reports, not legal case files, but memories. Scattered fragments I once thought buried with old photographs. Like the time Savannah and I climbed over the backyard fence to pick wild pears. Or the time I hid in the closet to eavesdrop on Mom and Grandpa arguing about a will I wouldn't understand until years later. It was the root of every crack that followed. I wrote in blue ink during quiet afternoons when sunlight spilled across the kitchen window. I wrote on rainy nights, when the wind pounded the roof and I remembered my sister lying next to me, whispering random stories just to help me sleep. And then one day, while I was in the small library adjusting our grant spreadsheets, Savannah came in holding an unfamiliar envelope. "Letter for you. From a lawyer named Harold Webb in Montpellier." I took it and opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Cassandra, if you're reading this, it means Mrs. Evelyn Morgan, the one we all knew as the quiet keeper of the family's truths, has left you something no one expected. Enclosed is a set of documents that has been in my office for 22 years, only to be released upon evidence that Savannah Blake is alive and has reclaimed her legal rights." I turned the page. It was a copy of a handwritten letter from my grandfather, never before disclosed. In it, he wrote about the danger that one day the legacy would be stripped from the ones most deserving, and about having created a hidden clause in the Vermont Land Trust, to be activated only if two conditions were met. Savannah Blake survived, and Cassandra Blake uncovered the truth. I set the letter down on the table. My chest stayed still for several seconds. Savannah sat across from me, her eyes shining like a child who'd just found a long-lost toy. "Grandpa believed in us from the beginning," I whispered. She nodded, her eyes a little red. "Maybe. He knew not everything right can be done out loud. But he left enough for us to find." That evening, we lit a fire in the backyard stove. It was me, Savannah, Misha, and 2 other women currently staying in the shelter room. No one said much. We passed around a mug of warm coffee, quietly watching the flames dance and letting time flow like something we no longer needed to hold too tightly. I thought of what Grandpa once told me during a winter when I was 12, as we sat on the porch of the old house. "Don't spend your life proving you're not invisible, Cassie. Live so that no one can ignore you when you walk into a room." I hadn't understood then, but now I knew. I had stepped into that room. Not a room in a house, but the room of truth, where people finally got to be seen. Not because they had to scream, but because someone had finally chosen to listen. If you've ever felt like you were left out of the important conversations in your own family, or carried a silent pain no one wanted to hear, then maybe you understand why I chose to tell this story. Not to blame anyone, but to give voice back to those who once had it taken. What do you think about the way my family chose to hide the truth? If it were you, would you return to the place that once hurt you to reclaim justice, or let the past stay buried? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Every story shared is a thread that pulls torn hearts closer together. And if you'd like to keep following along, hearing more real, deep, and sometimes painfully ironic stories about family, subscribe to this channel. There's more ahead, and sometimes, one small detail can change the way you see the world. See you in the next story.